This is the sternum. Know that the sternum is consisting of the manubrium sterni, the body of the sternum, and the xiphoid process, which is not present here. Concerning the manubrium sterni, we have this is the suprasternal notch, and the notch behind it there is the trachea, can be felt. And this is articulation for the clavicle, for the sternoclavicular joint. And this is articulation for the first rib. And the manubrium sterni articulate with the body of the sternum at the sternal angle, or the manubrio-sternal joint. This joint is important because, number one, it is felt in the living persons as a transverse ridge. If I pass from the suprasternal notch downwards, I can feel it. The rib articulating at this area is the second rib. So I can identify the second rib, and then I can count the ribs, third rib, fourth rib, and something else. Also, this sternal angle lies at the level of the lower border of thoracic 4, or opposite the disc between thoracic 4 and thoracic 5. The back of the manubrium sterni here, its lower half, is related to the arch of the aorta. So if I mark this area and say the structure related to it, so it will be the arch of the aorta. And this is the body of the sternum, which is related to ribs number 3 لغاية number 7, attached to the body of the sternum. The second rib, half of it articulate with the manubrium, and half of it articulate with the body. And then the third till the 7th costal cartilage articulating with the sternum. The xiphoid process is not present here, and it forms a joint with the body of the sternum, xiphi-sternal joint. And this joint lies at the level of the body of thoracic number 9. The body of the sternum has a cancellous bone inside it, which contains a red hemobiotic system. It forms blood. So during investigation of a blood disease, I can make a sternal puncture and aspirate some of this hemobiotic system to study the blood and the bone marrow. This is the rib. Concerning the ribs, we're either interested in either the typical rib or the first rib. Any more ribs we do not need. So classically, the rib has a head, and this head articulates with the body of the vertebra of the same number, and articulate with the body of the vertebra above, like that head, which is more prominent. This head articulates with the vertebra below of the same number and the vertebra above, followed by the neck. And this is the tubercle. The tubercle has a rough area and a facet articular surface to articulate with the transverse process of the vertebra of the same number, to articulate with the transverse process of the vertebra of the same number. This is the transverse process of the vertebra, and this is the tubercle. It articulates with the transverse process of the vertebra of the same number. And the joint is called costotransverse joint. And the rough area of this tubercle is attached to it the costotransverse ligament. So this is the head, and this is the neck and the tubercle. This is the angle of the rib, where the rib turns its direction. This angle of the ribs is the weakest point of the ribs and the common site for fractured ribs. And this is the body. The body has an upper border which is rounded and a lower border which is sharp. Near the lower border there is a groove from the inner side. This is the lower border which is sharp, and this is the groove above it immediately from at the inner side of the rib. It's called the costal groove. And this costal groove lodges three structures: the intercostal vein, below it is the intercostal artery, and the lowermost part is the intercostal nerve. The upper border here is rounded and receives the insertion of all the intercostal muscles. But the lower border here is sharp and gives origin to the external intercostal muscle. The internal intercostal muscle arises from the groove itself, and above it the innermost intercostal muscle. The anterior end of the rib is called the costal end. It articulates with the costal cartilage at a joint, costochondral junction, which is a primary cartilaginous joint. Does not move. Primary cartilaginous joint, the costochondral joint, between the costal cartilage and the anterior end of the rib. Concerning here the first rib, I will find this flattened, shorter. It has a head. It articulates only with the first thoracic vertebrae. And it has a neck and a tubercle that articulate with the transversal process of the first thoracic vertebrae. The body is flattened. It has an inner border and an outer border. The inner border contains a tubercle, where the insertion of the scalenus anterior lies, and it's called scalene tubercle. In front of it there is a groove for the subclavian vein, and posterior to it there is a groove for the subclavian artery and the lower trunk of the brachial plexus. This is by far the commonest features of the first rib. Scalene tubercle and the groove in front of it for subclavian vein, and the groove behind it for the subclavian artery and the lower trunk of the brachial plexus. Inner border in which attaches the suprapleural membrane above the apex of the lung. Concerning the main features of the thoracic vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae has a body which is a heart-shaped body, and this heart-shaped body is related to the the disc between the two vertebrae, intervertebral disc. So this green color, this is the body of the vertebra, and it's related to the intervertebral disc between the two vertebrae. The side of the body here has two facets, an upper articular facet and lower articular facet. The upper articular facet articulates with the rib of the same number, but the lower here articulates with the rib below it. And this is the transversal process. Characteristically, it has a facet, articular facet, which articulate with the tubercle of the same number rib to form the costotransverse joint. It articulates with the same number. If this is the third, so it articulates with the third rib. And this articulates with the third rib. and this articulate with the rib below, the fourth rib. This is superior articular facet, and there is an inferior articular facet to articulate with the vertebra above and the vertebra below. And this is the intervertebral notch through which the intercostal nerve, or the anterior division of the thoracic spinal nerve, arises from it. Spinal nerve comes from the spinal cord and then passes through this foramen to the outside. And this is the vertebral foramen, or the vertebral canal, in which lies the spinal cord covered by the meninges and nearly rounded. Characteristic of the thoracic vertebra, the spine. The spine is long and oblique. So the main features that if I find this spine long or oblique like that, it is thoracic. If I find the body is heart-shaped, it is thoracic. And the vertebral canal nearly rounded, it is thoracic. The body has two facets, superior and inferior, it is a thoracic. The transverse process has an articular facet, this is a thoracic vertebra. These are the main features of thoracic vertebra. In the exam, I can point this, identify the structure, the body of the vertebra. Name the structure related to it, intervertebral disc. I can mark this one, name the structure related to it. It articulates with the rib of the same number. I can mark this only, it articulates with the rib below it. I can mark the transverse process here, the articular facet. It articulates with the tubercle of the rib of the same number. And the spine also can be marked. This is the spine of the vertebra. This is the main feature of the thoracic vertebra. Stop it. The lung. The parts of the lung. Lung has an apex. And this apex of the lung, its surface anatomy, it lies 1 inch above the medial third of the clavicle. And it has a base, or the inferior surface, or the diaphragmatic surface. However, this is related to the diaphragm. And this is the right one. The liver is pushing it, so it is more concave. So apex and base, or the diaphragmatic surface. It has an anterior border, which is sharp. It has a posterior border, which is thick and blunt. It lies in the paravertebral gutter beside the vertebral column. So this is the anterior border, this is the posterior border, and this is the inferior border, which is sharp also. It has 3 surfaces. The surface here, which contains the hilum, where bronchi and vessels enter, this is the mediastinal surface, or the medial surface. And the surface which lies on the diaphragm is called the diaphragmatic surface, or the inferior surface, or the base of the lung. And then the other surface is the costal surface, where the ribs related to it and marks it. So costal surface, and then medial surface or mediastinal surface, and the inferior surface. Anterior border sharp, inferior border sharp, and the posterior border is blunt and thick. And this is the apex of the lung. Secondly, we have to differentiate between right and left lung. This is the left lung. And this is the right lung. If you look to both, I'll find the left lung is longer and thinner, but this is shorter and thick. The most important diagnostic is that the right lung contains 3 lobes, at the one lobe, the upper lobe, and this is the middle lobe, and this is the lower lobe. لكن left lung, it has only two lobes. It has an upper lobe and a lower lobe only. So in the practical exam, you can differentiate easily. If you find 3 lobes, this is the right lung. If you find 2 lobes only, this is the left lung. There is some variations about this, but in the exam, we do not put variations at all. If we look to the mediastinal surface, or the medial surface of the right lung, this is the hilum. I will find the bronchus, the right main bronchus, divides before it reaches the right lung. So I can find 2 bronchi in this lung. And this is the pulmonary artery in front of it. The part, this bronchus which lies above the artery is called epiarterial bronchus. And that below the artery, heparterial bronchus. And the pulmonary artery lies in front of them. There are 2 pulmonary veins. The superior pulmonary vein lies in the most anterior area, and the inferior pulmonary vein, which lies the more inferior structure. So I can be asked about what is this? The bronchus. What is this in front of the bronchus? Is the right pulmonary artery. And here, the most anterior structure here is the superior pulmonary vein. And the most inferior is the inferior pulmonary vein. These structures, when entered or leave the lung, is surrounded by a sheath of pleura, forming the root of the lung. And from the lower end of the root, there is a prolongation from this pleura. And this is a part of it. This is called the pulmonary ligament. The pulmonary ligament. Its main function is to allow distension of the veins during exercise. So this is the hilum of the right lung. Characteristically, it contains 2 bronchi. 1 pulmonary artery, superior pulmonary vein, and the inferior pulmonary vein. If we look to the hilum of the left lung, the left main bronchus enters the hilum as 1 bronchus. So I will find only 1 bronchus ahead. 1 main bronchus. And in front of it, the pulmonary artery. And this is the superior pulmonary vein, and this is the inferior pulmonary vein. So I find only 1 bronchus and pulmonary artery, left pulmonary artery, and this is the superior pulmonary vein, the most anterior, and this is the inferior pulmonary vein, the most inferior structure in the hilum. So differences between the hilum of both lungs also differentiate both lungs. And this is part of the pulmonary ligament. If we look to the structure related to mediastinal surface of the right lung, the main structures related to the mediastinal surface, there is a groove above the hilum here. And this groove for the azygous vein above the hilum of the right lung, the azygous vein. It has an important groove, the azygous vein. The azygous vein enters into the superior vena cava. And this is the groove for the superior vena cava. This is a groove for the superior vena cava. Behind it, there's a groove for the trachea and the esophagus. But the main important is if I put a needle above the hilum, it means groove for the azygous vein. If there is this groove for the superior vena cava. The superior vena cava enters into the right atrium. عشان كده this area is a cardiac impression related to the right atrium, covered by the pericardium. And the most inferior here, which is not prominent, the inferior vena cava impression. So the main impressions here, azygous, groove for the azygous vein, superior vena cava, cardiac impression for the right atrium and the pericardium, and inferior vena cava impression. Concerning the left lung is related to arteries. So this is the cardiac area. Cardiac impression related to the left ventricle covered by the pericardium. يطلع من الليفت ventricle الأورطة. Aorta has an ascending and then the arch of the aorta. So if I put any pointer above the hilum, so this is for the arch of the aorta. A big impression. And behind it there is a big impression also for the descending thoracic aorta. So the most important impressions here is the cardiac impression for the left ventricle and the left, the pericardium, groove for the arch of the aorta above the hilum, which is very big, and the groove for the descending thoracic aorta behind the hilum. Here, esophagus, but it is not very prominent. These are the most prominent. One of the also differences between the left lung and the right lung, the left lung has two lobes. And the more prominent thing, that this anterior border has a cardiac notch, and it has the lingula. The lingula correspond to the middle lobe in the right lung. Very common in the exam. The lingula is catched. This is the lingula. And this is the cardiac notch, and this is the anterior border of the left lung. And this is the oblique fissure for the left lung. And this is the lingula. لكن بالنسبة للرايت it has no lingula لأنها it has a middle lobe. It has no cardiac notch في الانterior border. No cardiac notch في الانterior border, no lingula لأنها it has the middle lobe. It has two fissures. The transverse fissure lies corresponding to the rib number 4. And this is the oblique fissure which corresponds to the rib number 6. They meet together at the mid-axillary line, dividing the lung into upper lobe, middle lobe, and the lower lobe. So this is the main things about the main features of the right lung and the main features of the left lung and the impressions on both the right and left lung. When you know the bronchopulmonary segment, you will know that the upper lobe contains 3 bronchopulmonary segments: the apical and anterior and posterior. However, the middle lobe contains 2 bronchopulmonary segments, medial and lateral. And the lower lobe contains 5 bronchopulmonary segments: apicobasal, anterior basal, posterior basal, lateral basal, and from the inside is the medial basal bronchopulmonary segment. But in the left lung, when you study the bronchopulmonary segment, you will know that the lower lobe is the same like that of the right lung. It has an apicobasal, anterior basal, posterior basal, lateral basal, and the medial basal. But this upper lobe, it contains apicoposterior and the anterior bronchopulmonary segment. And the lingula itself, it contains 2 bronchopulmonary segments, superior and the inferior. So you have to remember that the lingula contains superior and the inferior bronchopulmonary segment. لكن الميدل لوب ميدل بيبدأ بإم. فعلى طول طالما اسمع ميدل لوب يبقى أبدأ بإم كميديال ولاترال bronchopulmonary segment. لكن اللينجولا superior and the inferior bronchopulmonary segment. عشان كده في 1 segment deficient in the left lung compared to the right lung، لأن الأبر لوب كان في هنا في 3 كان في الرايت كان في ايبيكال وانتيرو بوستيرور. الايبيكال والبوستيرور اتجمعوا مع بعض وعملوا ايبيكو بوستيرور، فاصبحت دي واحده، والانتيرور واحده، واللينجولا سوبيرور وانفيرور ادول اربعه. هناك كانوا في الابر لوب 3 والميد لوب 2 ادي 5، فنقصت واحده. هنا ذا سيم فناقصه واحده. وفي بعض الكتب يقول لك لا ده ناقصه 2 لان اللور لوب هنا ناقص ايضا برونكو. it doesn't matter, it's not an important area of discussion. لكن اعرف اللينجولا برونكو بالمونري سيجمنت سوبيريور انفيريور برونكو بالمونري سيجمنت. ده المين ديفرنس ما بين الرايت لانج and the left lung. Stop it. Concerning the trachea. The trachea, this is the larynx. The trachea starts where the larynx ends, at the level of cervical 6 or at the level of the cricoid cartilage of the larynx. And the trachea passes into the neck and then in the superior mediastinum where it ends here. This is the trachea with its rings. It ends at the level of the sternal angle or the angle of Lewis or the lower border of thoracic 4 by giving the left main bronchus and the right main bronchus. In the neck, the trachea, you'll find this is the thyroid gland. This is the thyroid gland lies and the isthmus. The isthmus lies in front of the trachea, where the thyroid lobe lies lateral to the trachea, because this is the trachea. So this is the trachea. The isthmus of the thyroid gland lies in front of it, and each lobe lies on the lateral side of the gland. And also you'll find the carotid sheath posterolateral to the trachea. So the main relation of the trachea in the neck is, in front of it is the isthmus. Isthmus which connect the two lobes of the gland. It lies in front of trachea ring number 2, 3, and 4. Lateral to the trachea I'll find the thyroid lobe and the carotid sheath which contain the carotid artery and the internal jugular vein and the vagus nerve. This is the carotid sheath. Concerning the thoracic part, I'll find this is the trachea. To the left of it, I'll find the arch of the aorta. This is the arch of the aorta. The arch of the aorta starts in front of it and then becomes to the left side. On the right side also, I'll find the azygos arch. And this is the azygos vein. And then the arch arches over the hilum of the right lung to reach the back of the superior vena cava. So to the left of the trachea there is the aortic arch, and to the right of the trachea the azygos arch. حدش أحسن من حد. In front of the trachea بلاقي فيه vein ضخمة. This is the left brachiocephalic vein crossing in front of the trachea obliquely to join the right brachiocephalic vein to form the superior vena cava. And this is the azygos vein. If we look to the arch of the aorta, it gives the 3 main branches. The arch of the aorta gives the brachiocephalic artery, which lies in front and then to the right side of the trachea. And it gives the left common carotid artery to the left of the trachea, and the left subclavian artery, which is away from the trachea. The arch is crossed by 2 nerves. This is the vagus nerve, the left vagus, crossing the arch of the aorta. And while it crossing it, it gives a branch, which this one. This is the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. This is the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. From this left vagus, this is the left recurrent laryngeal nerve, which hooks around the arch and ascend between the trachea and the esophagus. This is the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. There is no right in the thorax. Behind the trachea, this is the trachea, lies the esophagus. Behind the trachea lies the esophagus. And in between them, the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. This is the right main bronchus, shorter. This is the left main bronchus, longer. The right, wider. The left, narrower. The right is in more line with trachea, but the left forms an angle with the trachea. The right divides into two bronchi before it enters the lung. Like this divides only inside the lung, giving two main bronchus. Like this gives the upper lobe, the superior lobar bronchus, and the inferior lobar bronchus before it enters the hilum. This is why in the hilum of the right lung I will find two bronchi. Behind the trachea, this is the esophagus. Attached to the diaphragm here is the right vagus, is the right phrenic nerve. Reaches the diaphragm on the right side, so this is the right phrenic nerve. The right vagus nerve, it lies immediately in front of the trachea, on the right side of the trachea. The right vagus nerve, it lies immediately to the right side of the trachea. So this is the right vagus, and this is the right phrenic. Phrenic رايح للdiaphragm. And this is the left vagus, because it passes to the esophagus and not reaches the diaphragm. This is the left vagus nerve. Behind it, there is the left phrenic nerve, and I think it is cut. The left phrenic nerve, it crosses also the side of the aortic arch. So the vagus, and this is the phrenic nerve. The left phrenic nerve. And this is the diaphragm. The diaphragm. And this diaphragm separates the abdomen from the thorax. On its upper surface attached the pericardium, which covers the heart. And this is the pericardium. And this is attached to the central tendon of the diaphragm, and it is pierced by an opening of the inferior vena cava. The inferior vena cava has to open the diaphragm, has to open the pericardium to reach the right atrium. From the abdomen, as you know, the origin of the diaphragm, it arises by two crura, reglain, the right crust of the diaphragm and the left crust of the diaphragm. Left crust of the diaphragm, right crust of the diaphragm. And this is the central tendon of the diaphragm. And this is the aortic opening, where the abdominal or thoracic aorta descends through it. And this is the caval opening for the inferior vena cava to enter. And the third one is the esophageal opening, opening for the esophagus. This opening for the esophagus. It is not a clear suprarenal gland. It is not a clear specimen. But this is the diaphragm. And on the left side, left crust of the diaphragm. On the right, right crust of the diaphragm. It is not clear specimen. It's very bad specimen. And this is the pericardium attached to the central tendon of the diaphragm. This is the trachea. And this is the right phrenic nerve. On the right side of the trachea is the right vagus nerve. And this is the azygous vein entering into the superior vena cava. And this is the arch of the aorta. The trachea, behind the trachea is the esophagus. This is the left vagus nerve, giving the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. which hooks around the arch of the aorta. The arch, it passes from front backwards and passes upwards between the trachea and the esophagus. Stop it.